Tech Nuggets, VMware vCenter for a home lab. So vCenter, what is vCenter? vCenter is the appliance, which is basically a virtual machine that we put into our environment that turns around and manages all of our ESXi instances. So if I've got 15 ESXi hypervisors, I don't want to have to log into each one individually to try to manage the VMs on that. And it lets us do some other cool stuff like vMotion, where I can move a VM from one host to another as it's running. I can manage storage and network in a central location, and all the hypervisors will see it. So it's some level of, organization structure where I can see all my VMs in one place, but it also has a configuration management aspect that lets me manage all those resources in one spot and not have to go to each host to try to set up and make sure I got it all right. In this instance, we're talking about how do I use it at home in a home lab. So if I want to deploy vCenter in a home lab so I can learn about it and get to know it and what, that kind of thing, how do I do that? And in our case, we're using VMware Workstation, and we're going to deploy it as a VM inside VMware Workstation. Previously in the lab, I've created a ESXi instance, which was in another video that I did, and we'll deploy VMware Workstation as at a parallel level with that ESXi instance. So it'll be not recursively hypervised, it'll be only in VMware Workstation as its own object. And that way we'll be able to log into its web interface and manage ESXi and that kind of thing. In a data center environment, we might do it a little differently. I have a different video for how to deploy ESXi in a data center environment because there's some different options that go with that. So refer to that one if you're interested. So we will go on to the practical demonstration. All right, so here we go. We got our handy dandy VMware Workstation. We've got ESXi loaded into it from our previous video. And we're gonna bring in and configure and import, vCenter 7 to work with it. So we're gonna basically just go to a file and open. And I have downloaded the ISO and unpacked it, unzipped it basically into a folder where I can get at it. And we're gonna go to where the OVA file. OVAs are basically pre-made VMs that are ready to be imported. So we're just gonna open it, which is going to turn around and suck it in. It's going to ask us a bunch of questions about basically install questions. So we're going to accept the EULA, and we're going to give it a name and a place to live, vCenter 7, and I'm going to put it with my other VMs, vCenter 7. And it's going to ask what kind. We're going to use Tiny, which is in a lab environment is going to be super great. If you need more, you're probably installing it in a different way. Refer to our larger vCenter data center install because it kind of goes about a different way. So it's going to ask some things. You can always come over here to this little bubble and mouse over it, and the tooltip will give you some ideas of what you should be putting into it. Now we're going to do one that does not require DNS. So we're going to ask it for IPv4. It's going to ask, do we want static or DHCP? And we're going to put in static because that's we've got IP addresses already set out. Like from VMware Workstation, so we'll know what those are. And our tooltip here is asking for a network address. So we're going to give it 192.168.220.51. Oops, 51. You know what? We're not. We're going to give it 10 because 50 was ESXi. And so if we had a second ESXi, it'd be 51. So we'll put ours on 220.10. And a host network prefix is either dotted decimal or in 24 will be the same thing as saying this, right? That's 8 times 3, 8 plus 8 plus 8. We can do it that way. We need to know our gateway, which should be this. 220.2 is our gateway, and our DNS is going to be the same thing, 2. We don't really have a network identity. We're going to advertising themselves. We're going to leave that one blank, and we're going to turn around. Now, don't hit import because it tends to want to just go on. You need to work your way through all of these, and you have to click individually on them. So I need to give it a password, and the complexity requirements are going to be over here, which is going to be 1 capital and a number and a special character. So you'll have to type it in twice. that. And then we go to system configuration where it's going to ask for a root password with the same complexity issues. And of course they have to match. Here it's asking a variety of questions that we're frankly not going to answer. Since we're not installing it inside of an ESXi, we're putting it in as a separate. We don't have to worry a ton about some of these. All right, there are a few miscellaneous. This is their SEEP is the VMware. Hey, we want to know what you're doing. You'll send us log files. I tend to leave it as false. Networking properties, again, these are DNS kind of things we don't need to worry about. And then we're going to hit import. And this is going to go for a while, so we'll fast forward through it. All right, so at this point you can see we've made it to a console window, and it's kind of gone to sleep on us here. But if we click on it and maybe hit shift a little bit, you'll see that it will wake up. Come on, there we go. And it'll give us a purple or a blue screen as opposed to ESXi, which tends to give us the yellow screen of wakefulness here. So you can tell the difference by looking at the console as to what's what. And that's not that unusual. But you can also see it gives us our IP address. It tells us that we're statically assigned here. One of the things that it didn't really let me pick, that it by default kind of makes an assumption about when I set the VM up, didn't really let me pick what network. And so I need to go into settings and change it, because right now it's set on bridged, and I really need it to be on my NAT network so that it's with everything else. So we'll go over and set it to NAT and hit OK. And this is basically the same thing as unplugging it from one network and plug it into another network physically, and it should come up and be fine. It won't even need a reboot. All right, so I've got my web browser open here. I've got a tab for ESXi that I used last time that goes directly to my ESXi server, and I've got a new tab open that is going to go to 220.10, but it's going to this special port, and the 5480 port is different than just the regular, web server on it. So the regular web server on it, you would go to when you want to use vCenter as a normal everyday application where you're going to manage VMs and hosts and all that other good stuff. The 5480 is the administrative web server where we're going to go and be able to work with the appliance itself. So if I need to run updates for vCenter, if I need to look at specific things for vCenter itself, I don't actually manage that through the normal web server. It has its own web server site for that. And again, we're going to have, a self-signed cert, so we're going to have to say yes to this kind of stuff. In Google, you'll get, Chrome, you'll get very similar things, and it'll leave us here at the finishing mark, right? It wants to know how to finish this up. So if you've tried to go to the main website and it didn't come up, if you just went to that, that's why, because it's not ready yet. It needs to finish it up. So we've installed it, but we need to do some additional steps to get it finished. So we're going to use setup because we're going to configure a new vCenter, because that's what this is a new vCenter. It's going to want the vCenter password that we created, and it'll want to log in. So it's going to ask us a series of questions. Go away. Last pass about that. And this one you can generally sort of wander through. It's going to ask us a lot of the same questions that we filled in earlier. Hopefully, I was going to say it's going to fill in a bunch of those answers for us. We can go back and turn SSH on later if we want to. Again, you can SSH into the appliance itself. Not normally needful, which is why it's disabled, but sometimes you need to. It'll ask us some SSO questions. SSO stands for single sign-on. So it's gonna ask us a couple of questions about that too. All right, so this is the one place where it's going to look like we're going to want DNS, but we're not. And if you look very closely right here, it says vSphere local, and that's exactly what we're going to type in there, vSphere.local. And that means our login for the administrator user is going to be administrator@vSphere.local. And what this is telling it is we don't have DNS. If we had used a domain here, it's going to go out and look for that kind of stuff. So you can't just make anything up you want and put it in here. We actually have to use something specific. And by using vSphere.local, we're saying, hey, I don't have anything. I'm just going to use a local domain. And that's what .local is. Again, we're going to have to give it a single sign-on password here for administrator. I use the same password I use as my root user in the administrative side to log in. You don't have to, but in a lab environment, it's a lot easier that way. And if you have a single sign-on domain that you can join, you can click this option and it'll let you do that kind of stuff. Lab environment, you probably don't. All right, so remember we talked about SEEP earlier. I am not joining SEEP for my lab environment. Thank you, no. And it will give me a, sort of an overview of what we did and what we didn't do and are we ready, and we'll hit finish and let it chug away. Are you really, really sure? I'm really, really sure. Which eventually leaves us back here at the login screen. And so I'm logging in to the appliance side, not to the vCenter side. So this is the overall, how am I looking, how healthy am I, what version am I, all that kind of stuff. And you can monitor it, look at its health status and CPU utilization. The most important thing tends to be the update settings. That's what most people want. And because it's so new, they haven't really done that yet. Normally you'd come down here and you'd say check CD-ROM or URL. You can get offline bundles for VMware appliances, vCenter appliances, and you'd say go check it, and it would run off down the way and do that kind of stuff. For the most part, that's about the only reason I am here. They'll list all of them. Usually the ones at the bottom are the oldest ones, and they're a roll-up of everything above it. So you can pick it and say stage and install, and it'll install it. It'll tell you a little about, do I need to reboot, and will I have to update, and how long will it take, and will everything be down or not, and stuff like that. But this is purely for vCenter management kind of things. When we want to see the rest of it, we'll have to go back and go to the main page, which will be just this piece. And like that. And that should take us to the main website. And again, since we've never been there, it's going to complain. It's going to say, hey, I need a cert. Different website, different self-signed cert. Again, production, we'd have real certs. It's going to leave you here. We're going to launch the vCenter HTML5 client. And there we go. It's going to take a little bit to log in. You'll notice the example here is a domain.local. This is where we're going to use administrator at vSphere.local. And give it our password. I hope I didn't twinkle finger it. And it'll eventually let us in. Now, at this point, we're going to have a vCenter that is all by its lonesome. It's not managing anything, and it's a management interface to manage other ESXi resources. So we're going to need to pull that resource in, even though we haven't done it yet. There we go. We're pulling up the main vCenter interface here. And it's going to complain about my licenses. If I had, the license will say, hey, the eval license runs 60 days and we'll be all good. So for a lab environment, the eval license is great. You can see here, I've got the IP address of ESXi, and that's the object that's at the very top. So one of the first things we're going to need to do is create a data center. Got to have at least one. We can just call it data center. Doesn't have to be anything magical. We're going to have a hierarchy here that's an organizational hierarchy. So we're going to create anything we want will be created on here. Multiple data centers. We can have folders, clusters. vCenter supports all these advanced features. For right now, we just want somewhere to drop VMs. So we'll just call it VMs. And at this point, we've got a bit of a hierarchy going on, and we can do some other things like, hey, I kind of want to pull in my, vCenter. What's that going to look like? We're going to go to data center, and we're going to say add host. And we're going to add it by IP address. So 192.168.220. I think I said -50, if I recall correctly. And it will go and ask for a username and a password. Now, the username and password is the root user for the ESXi server that we set up earlier. So that may be a different password. It's the same user, which is a little confusing as our administrative interface, but it may be a different password, so keep that in mind. It will go out and basically it's trying to SSH into it to check it. So that's why we get these SHA-1 thumbprints, because it's basically doing a SSH connection. And it will give us a host summary. It'll tell us, no, LastPass, go away. It'll tell us what the IP address is, what it's seeing on the other side, right? We're seeing ESXi 7, and how many virtual machines. I have that test VM that I built from before. So we'll have to ask it if I have licenses here, this is where I'll assign licenses and do that kind of stuff. Lockdown mode, not something we're going to use. It's a security mode. Might use it in your production world. Certainly wouldn't use it in a lab environment. Wants to know, what do I do with all the VMs that I'm pulling in? And if I have a big hierarchy, I want to put them somewhere. And if I don't know what to do with them, I'll stick them somewhere. And it'll even create a folder called like discovered virtual machines or something like that if it doesn't know what to do with it. But we can select, hey, I'm going to bring them in. I'm going to stick them here in the hierarchy. And it gives you a little overview of what it's going to do. And you hit finish and it should pull it all right in. It'll take a minute. It says it's disconnected, but you can see down here at the bottom, it's adding a standalone host. So the host will go from being standalone to being managed by vCenter. And when we go log into that, you'll see our VM showed up. Ta-da, look at that. Now we are looking at things here in its host and cluster mode. So it's showing me data centers and hosts that the VMs run on. If I want to look at it in a more organizational view where I can create the folders and organize them any way I want, we can go in here, and that's where the VM folder came in. And any of the other folders that we might create to organize and assign rights to would show up here. Storage view is going to show up this way, and it's going to be organized by storage. If I have multiple ESXi servers, I may see multiple local storage options for each one of them. If you had SAN, those options would show up in here. And the last one is network, where the VM network that we saw in ESXi is also here. We can set up distributed virtual switches now that we have Virtual Center, which means I configure once here in Virtual Center, and every host that gets added, that distributed virtual switch becomes part of, and that way I don't have to configure all the networks on each different host that I bring in as I work with it. It saves me all that overhead time. I can get it right in one place, and it'll push that configuration out to all the other hosts that are part of my Virtual Center. I tend to work most of my life in this view because I tend to organize my VMs into folders and things like that, and then I can look at them and work with them. And you can see here we've got monitoring and all sorts of other things it can do as it goes to monitor different things. I can turn them on and turn them off. I can look at them and view them and manage them and edit them and all that kind of good stuff. I can go in here and edit settings. And I can do a variety of other things in here. I can add devices, and it's very similar to what you can do in ESXi. The big difference here is I can clone, which I couldn't do in ESXi, and I can snapshot, which I couldn't do in ESXi. Those are the two big ones that really, if you're using VMs from day to day, you'll want those two. They're a big deal. A lot of the distributed configuration is super big time saver, but at the day-to-day level, cloning and snapshotting is one of those things I do quite a bit. I hope you've enjoyed this Tech Nugget. We'll be doing more in the future. We'll probably be covering VirtualBox and some things we can do with that, but there'll be more. So we'll see you next time.